Chapters 1 and 2 of The Deadly Dust by Murray Leinster. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Phil Chenevert. The Deadly Dust by Murray Leinster. This story was first published in Thrilling Wonder Stories, August 1947. Chapter 1. Where is Bud Gregory? A sturdy fishing boat wallowed and rolled and heaved and pitched in the huge, slow swells of mid-Pacific. It looked very much like any other fishing boat, and remarkably like those tuna boats that put out from the west coast of the United States and pursue their prey for as many thousands of miles as may be necessary. It was just over 100 feet long, and was powered obviously by a diesel engine. There was just one thing odd about the boat, and one oddity about its crew, and one about the object it towed, and one about its wake. The odd thing about the boat was that something remarkably like a radar antenna was fitted atop its pilot house. The oddity about its crew was that every man wore heavy protective clothing of a sort usually found only among workers about atomic piles. The oddity about the object it towed was that, aside from the supporting pontoons that kept it afloat, it was made of lead. It was a torpedo-shaped object about 40 feet long and no more than 8 or 10 feet in diameter, kept from sinking by sheet metal floats on either side. The oddity of the wake was that it was quite clear for a few miles, and then, miles and miles behind, dead fish lay on the water. It was possible to backtrack the tuna boat for a long, long way by dead fish lying on the surface. Of course, perhaps 50 miles astern, the dead fish had been scattered by the waves, and the trail had been thinned out and was not so clear. But the fishy corpses made a trail for 100 miles beyond that if you look for them. Curiously, the trail was equally dense along its whole length, as if a certain poisonousness only had been towed through the water and did not spread afterward. There was an oddity in the behavior, too, of the small craft after a while. The radar antenna turned and flickered here and there, restlessly. It searched the horizon exhaustively. Then, suddenly, an oily liquid came out of the torpedo-shaped leaden object. It bubbled to the surface and spread out. It evaporated very quickly, though. The vapor was blown to the eastward by the wind. The seeming tuna boat forged ahead sturdily, towing that odd object, which now gushed out a volatile liquid which evaporated quickly, and whose fumes were blown away. It went on for miles and miles and miles, its radar antenna flickering nervously about the horizon, while the transient film of oily stuff trailed behind it. And there was another peculiarity. The trail of dead fish grew much thicker after the liquid spread out to dry up and blow away to eastward. Instead of 40 or 50 fish per mile, there were hundreds. In one place where a school of some finny sort had swum beneath the temporary layer of oil, the ocean was almost carpeted with scaly, belly-up corpses. On August 8th, the background count of all the standard Geiger-Miller tube on the Pacific coast, from Oregon to Southern California, went up from 1 to 3 to 3 to 5 per minute per square centimeter of tube surface. On the same day, Bud Gregory found a new home for his family, and Bud Gregory was, though the fact made him extremely unhappy, the most important man in the United States, perhaps the most important man in the world. He was in hiding because of it. He was so much more than a mere genius that there is no possible way to describe him, and therefore he drove furtively by back roads up through Northern California and across Oregon, and finally found a home for his family fronting on one of the minor inlets opening on Puget Sound. The house was an abandoned shack built of shakes, slabs cut off logs to square them for a sawmill, and it was in the last stages of dilapidation. But Bud Gregory viewed it with vast satisfaction. So did his family. His tow-headed children regarded the brush that went back to the hills with lively anticipation. It was cut overland, with only a seed tree standing here and there. The older boys inspected the water in view with enthusiasm. Bud Gregory's wife noted that the stove, left behind when the shack was abandoned, could be patched with flattened tin cans or sheet iron to serve admirably, and that there was a spring only 100 yards from the house. She learned that there was a very small town only 4 or 5 miles away. She was content. So Bud Gregory's family unloaded pots, pans, bedding, 2 hound dogs, certain folding cots, and assorted gunny sacks of provisions and canned goods from the car. They moved in. There were berries and wood greens for the girls to pick nearby. There were rabbits to snare and fish to catch for the boys, and nobody was likely to try to make anybody go to school. Bud Gregory's family was happy. As the sun went down, with the ancient and decrepit jalopy standing forlornly beside the really quite unspeakable shack, Bud Gregory sat comfortably on the sagging doorstep and leaned back against the rotting sidewall. He reflected complacently that nobody was likely to bother him here for a long time to come. He could sit in the sun and not be bothered. In a very real sense, he was the greatest physicist yet known on Earth. He had the greatest command over subatomic particles of any human being so far born. His profession was the repair of hopelessly disarranged automobiles, but his occupation, his avocation, and his only desire was simply to sit and do nothing. Sometimes, though, he liked to drink a little beer. On August 9th, the background count of standard Geiger-Miller tubes was up to 3 to 5 per minute per square centimeter so far east as St. Louis. On the coast, it was up to 5 to 7. On August 10th, the count was 3 to 5 in the Atlantic states, 5 to 7 in the center of the country, and 7 to 9 on the Pacific coast. There was another small fishing boat plowing its way through the long, slow mid-Pacific swells, towing an odd object which was supported by floats. There had been another one before it, and another before that. Like its fellows, which had made these strange patrols, towing lead-sheathed torpedo-shaped objects, this fishing boat also never seemed to fish. Not even when there were very plain evidences of tuna in profitable quantities all about. The boat forged ahead, its radar flickering about the horizon. Suddenly, the movement of the radar antenna ceased. It remained fixed in one position, and one position only. Then, as suddenly, men ran about the boat's deck. They hastily assembled machine guns at the stern. There were sharp tearing noises above the droning hum of the diesel engine. Tiny puffs of smoke were torn away from the muzzles of the machine guns by the wind which blew to the east. Bullets ripped and tore the sheet steel floats. Great gashes appeared in the plating. Water poured into the supporting pontoons. A protective suit-clad sailor swung an axe, and the tow rope parted. The lead object settled and sank swiftly. Seconds after it was out of sight, the only crew members who appeared on deck wore commonplace working clothes. When a 4-motored Trans-Pacific flying clipper droned out of the mistiness of the horizon, there was nothing out of the ordinary in view. The radar antenna was invisible. It had been unshipped. And, of course, the thing that had been towed was far, far below the surface. The Geiger-Miller tube background count did not rise on August 11th or 12th, but on the 13th, when it was 7 to 9 in the eastern and central states, it made another jump. It went up to 8 to 10 on the coast. The matter began to look serious. Bud Gregory and his family, however, paid no heed. The older boys had explored their immediate surroundings very happily. The family dined on woodcock, out of season, rabbits, fish, and cornbread. The oldest boy of all, age 14, trudged all the way to the nearby small town and reported that there was a movie theater there which showed films twice a week. Beer was to be had. There were 2 stores and a post office and a consolidated school, a small bowling alley, a sawmill, and a hospital, all out of proportion to the town itself. He was not impressed. He went fishing. On August 14th, the background count on the West Coast was 9 to 11. On the 15th, it was 10 to 12. And on the 16th, it was 12 to 15. In the rest of the country, the count climbed steadily. In Washington, D.C., standard counters clicked at the 10 to 12 rate, and Dr. David Murfree became convinced that something was very, very wrong. The background count for standardized Geiger-Miller tubes is a measure of the normal everyday radioactivity of the Earth as a whole. When a tube of given dimensions, with given pressure and given voltage applied, indicates that stray subatomic particles have passed through it at the rate of from 1 to 3 per minute for each square centimeter of its surface, the cosmos is normal. But when the rate goes up over the entire United States, so that one has to assume that the radioactivity of the whole nation's surface has multiplied itself at least 4 times, it is upsetting. Dr. David Murfree's title was a science doctorate. Because of the raised background count, he went to his superiors in Washington and asked for leave. He had a hunch that he had better find Bud Gregory and ask some questions about the matter. It was not a pleasant interview. For a civil service employee to ask some special concession from his superiors is always unpleasant, and Murfree was not in the good graces of his bosses. By his rating, he drew a salary of $4,700 a year, and by his seniority, he could not be fired without formal charges and a hearing. But his superiors disapproved of him. When an atomic pile started up of itself in the Great Smokies, Murfree, to be sure, had managed to get it stopped on his own initiative, and had presented to the United States the greatest known store of artificial radioactive material on Earth. But Bud Gregory, who was responsible for that gigantic pile, had got away into the anonymity of tramp motordom. And again, when there was good prospect of an atomic war, with the United States on the receiving end of a well-organized attack, Murfree had managed to find Bud Gregory and, according to his own report, had prevented that attack too. But again, Bud Gregory had slipped away, and Murfree could bring back nothing but a smashed and inoperative device he declared was responsible for the safety of the United States. True, 3 dead men were found where Murfree had said they would be, and they had been killed by bullets from guns they held in their hands, and the bullets had gone in backward, which made Murfree's otherwise improbable story rather plausible. But his immediate superior did not approve of him because he had brought back neither Bud Gregory nor a painstaking report with math and diagrams, which could be issued as essentially the product of the organizing genius of the administrative officers of the Bureau. So, on August 17th, while Bud Gregory sat peacefully in the sunshine and his children picked berries, Dr. David Murfree sat in the office of his section's administrative officer and argued. "But there's nothing else to do. I have to take some leave." The administrative officer was displeased. "I don't think Gregory's responsible," explained Murfree patiently. "He knows better now. All he wants is to be left alone to loaf and drink beer. He won't do anything to draw attention to himself, more's the shame and pity, and anything that would increase basic radioactivity would decidedly be on the show-off side. But he's the only man who could possibly solve the problem." The administrative officer scowled darkly. "It isn't the whole Earth, remember," said Murfree as patiently as before. "Only the United States. That means something quite preposterous. It's not dangerous yet, but it isn't right. I've got to take some leave to see if I can find Gregory and get an explanation." The administrative officer was no scientist. He pointed out that Murfree was asking for a leave when everybody else in the Bureau wanted his vacation. If Murfree left his duty, it would be considered that he had resigned. Murfree clamped his jaw. "Oh, the deuce," he said angrily. "In that case, I've resigned. I'm going. I've got to." The small fleet of seeming tuna boats had developed a regular routine. One or more lay at a dock where a shed jutted out over the water and could easily hide 2 or 3 lead-sheathed objects to be towed. At least one plowed sturdily across the ocean, its radar flickering incessantly in every direction to detect and warn of any other ship or any aircraft which might presently come into sight. If the radar reported another ship, however far away, the tuna boat and its tow changed course to avoid a meeting. If a meeting could not be avoided, the tow could be sunk, and of course on the tuna boat there wasn't anything peculiar which couldn't be thrown overboard if it became necessary to prove its utter innocence. The island, which was the small fleet's base, was small itself and very seldom visited. If anybody did come, its entire population of perhaps 70 souls was united. Personnel had been chosen and trained to distract the attention of any possible visitor from the things that were the real background of the ship's activities. It should not be difficult. After all, atomic piles are not so large and can be built and hidden underground, and the necessary shielding can be made to look like perfectly natural parts of an island landscape. The fishing boats went about their routine. They were very busy, but they didn't catch any fish. They didn't try. On August 22nd, the acceptance of Murfree's unwritten resignation came through. He scowled at the slip and then cleaned out his desk and went home. On that day, the background count in the east was 25 to 28. On the Pacific coast, it was 32 to 35. This meant that in 2 weeks, the radioactivity of the surface soil of the United States had multiplied itself 10 times. If it doubled itself just 6 times more, there wouldn't be any United States. There might not be any world. But out in the state of Washington, looking out over Puget Sound from his happily somnolent seat before the shack of moldering shakes, Bud Gregory decided that he would like to have some beer. He counted up his money and sent his oldest son to the town 4 miles away to bring back 6 bottles. For speed, he let the 14-year-old boy use the antique automobile in which the family had wandered across the continent. The boy cranked up the jalopy and drove away. It was very fortunate that he did so. Murfree heard about it and therefore was able to locate Bud Gregory. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2, What's in it for me? Murfree had a very bad conscience. Now, when his wife had set her heart upon a vacation at the seashore with their little daughter — Washington is an oven in the summer — he had joined the ranks of the unemployed. But Murfree knew that he had to hunt for Bud Gregory. He had to. "Somebody's got to do it," he told his wife defensively. "And after all, I'm the only person he'll work with." His wife waited. "It's lunatic," said Murfree, "but what can I do? The whole country is getting more radioactive. The normal count has gone up 10 times. It goes up in waves which start on the Pacific coast and move east. There's no rise in Europe, Asia, South America, or anywhere else. It isn't dangerous yet, but it's heading that way. Somebody's got to find out about it." "Why must it be you?" asked his wife. "Because nobody else will," he told her vexedly. "There's a certain amount of radiation which is normal. There's a certain amount which is safe. The amount all over the United States is away above normal. It's still safe, but it's heading for the point where it won't be." "Well?" his wife said. "A certain amount more," said Murfree, "and there'll be a terrific increase in the number of abnormal babies, freaks, mutations, monsters. A little beyond that, there'll be no babies. The rest of the living world would follow. A little more, and plants will begin to throw sports. More yet, and plants will become sterile. Seeds will cease to grow. A little more radiation than that, and we'll all tend to develop cancer. And still more, and we'll begin to run fevers and die of radiation burns." "And you're the only person who sees it?" said his wife bitterly. "So you have to spend your money trying to find this Gregory and bribe him to do something?" "But," said Murfree again, "nobody else will." Which was true. Twice before he'd spent his own savings for the safety of his family, while all other families got their safety free. His conscience bothered him, but there wasn't anything else to do. Rather guiltily, he called a friend who made microchemical analyses for the FBI. He asked if he could be notified if any events took place of the sort, he described it specifically, which would mean Bud Gregory was involved. Then he doggedly made ready to take his family to the seashore. Employed or not, his daughter needed fresh air and sunshine, and the sea after a year in Washington. 2 days later, he had them settled at the beach. He'd packed up the one personally owned souvenir of his encounters with Bud Gregory. He went to the largest privately owned power generating station in the United States. He demonstrated the gadget. He left it installed. Then he called back to Washington on long distance. He had a certain amount of money by this time, a fee for the experimental use of Bud Gregory's gadget, and within limits he could travel. There was news. His friend in the FBI told him of a happening which sounded as if Bud Gregory was involved. So Murfree headed for the Pacific coast by air. A very decrepit vessel cast anchor off the small island of the tuna boats. It made cryptic signals, and the population of the island came rejoicing to the dock to greet its crew. Of course, the people of the island did not use radios for communication. Radio messages can be intercepted, and, if sent in code, arouse curiosity. The decrepit vessel, therefore, brought news. It was good. The news consisted of background count measurements made in different cities of the United States over some weeks past. The men who had made the measurements were passengers on the ship which brought them. They were highly elated. They were taken to see the atomic piles which had produced the measurements. They bowed profoundly before the atomic engines which silently produced death for a nation. And that night there was celebration on the island. But the tuna boat due to leave went out on schedule despite the festivities. It towed a torpedo-shaped lead object behind it. On the 29th of August, the background count of standard Geiger-Miller tubes on the west coast was 56 to 58, and still going up. The radioactivity constant of the United States had risen to something like 25 times normal. It showed no tendency to stop. Bud Gregory's boy was in trouble. The event itself was not important, but it enabled Murfree to find Bud Gregory. The happening occurred within half an hour after Bud sent his son to town for some beer. The 14-year-old boy chuffed away from the shack into which his family had moved. The car in which Bud Gregory had taken his tribe across the continent was an ancient and dilapidated rattletrap. By any normal standard, it should have wheezed its last mile years before. It had a cloth top, a cracked windshield, and, when it was running exclusively on its motor, it made noises like a broken-down coffee grinder working on a protesting cat. It should have groaned at any grade and balked at any really perceptible incline. Its absolute maximum of speed should have been 20 miles an hour downhill. But Bud Gregory was something very much more than a genius. He had made a gadget for his car. It was a radio tube and a coil or two, the windings being made in a fashion nobody else could understand, and Bud Gregory could not explain. When the gadget was turned on and attached to any bit of metal, things happened. Normally, the molecules of, say, the metal of any automobile engine block move in all directions in a strictly random fashion. When Bud Gregory's gadget operated, the molecules of the same automobile block moved in the same direction, ahead. If the motor wasn't running, the metal cooled down as the heat energy it contained was turned into kinetic energy. If it was kept running, the burning fuel in its cylinders kept it from going so far below zero that it would condense liquid air upon itself. The gadget was still attached to the motor of the ancient car. It had helped pull the car across the continent and was solely responsible for the fact that it had pulled the Rockies. Now it was turned off. The boy turned it on. The car began to ride smoothly and easily with seemingly infinite power. It came out of the narrow woods road upon a main highway. The 14-year-old boy turned up the gadget. The ancient jalopy breezed up to 60 miles an hour, 70, 80. A horn blared its astonishment as a motorcycle cop flashed past, going in the opposite direction. Bud Gregory's son heard the cop's brakes squeal. He was going to turn around and come in pursuit. The flapping, squeaking, preposterous flivver hit 120 miles an hour as the scared boy lit out. He rounded a curve. The small town lay before him. In panicky haste, he turned the knob to reverse the molecular drive of the four-wheeled wreck he drove. In 50 yards, it dropped from 120 miles to 10. He snapped off the drive and limped into town on 3 cylinders. He parked the car in an inconspicuous place and went in and got the beer. He lingered uneasily, afraid to go back until the motor cop should have vanished. The motor cop came into town, swearing. The boy saw him ask questions. He moved out of sight. The boy got into the car and stowed the beer. Then he saw the cop heading for his car where it was parked. The cop looked purposeful. The small boy cringed. He shared his father's terror of the law. When the motor cop was 10 yards away, Bud Gregory's son reacted in panic. He flipped over the molecular drive switch, and the car plunged forward. It dented the fender of the car ahead of it, sideswiped a farm truck, upset a "Keep Right" sign, and flashed for the open road with no sound of any running engine. The motor cop lunged for his motorcycle and roared in pursuit. A 14-year-old boy is not a startlingly conservative driver at any time. Bud Gregory's son was filled with stark terror. On the 2-mile stretch of straight road just around the first curve, he gave the car all the speed that molecular heat energy would yield. It wasn't the same as atomic power, but it was plenty. The motor cop reached the curve just in time to see the jalopy stop almost as abruptly as if it had run into a brick wall, but unharmed, and go careening into the woods road. The cop roared in pursuit. He didn't catch up, but in the winding woods road, he ran into patches of below-zero frigidity that almost scared him into giving up the chase. The boy had forgotten to start the engine, and when you extract from a motor block the heat energy required to drive a flivver 4 miles at top speed, with acceleration and deceleration thrown in, it gets cold. It left a trail of almost condensed air behind it. The wreck happened just 50 yards from the shack in which Bud Gregory's family had settled down. The car slid off the road at the last curve, plowed through 50 yards of underbrush and spindling saplings, came at last to an immovable stump, and had reached the end of its journeying. The boy was completely unhurt, but his toes were frostbitten on the 29th of August, on a bright sunshiny day, with all the woods rioting in lush green growth. The motor cop got no adequate explanation. Bud Gregory was shaken, but firm in his resolution to play dumb. He couldn't explain anything, but the boy's toes were frostbitten. In the end, the cop took the boy back to the hospital to have his toes treated, resolving to return to examine the wreck. But of course, when he got back, there was no gadget to discover, and absolutely nothing to explain the car's speed, the boy's frostbitten toes, or a patch of frost-killed vegetation in August, where the wreck still lay crumpled. It was this obstinately inexplicable situation that had been reported to Murfree by his friend of the FBI. So he reached that small town as fast as planes would take him, and found Bud Gregory sitting miserably on the steps of the small town's hospital. The most important man in the United States was acutely unhappy. His son was going to have to pay a fine for reckless driving, The hospital would charge something. His car was wrecked beyond even his ability to repair it. The motor block had burst, of course, when the water in the circulating system froze. And he might have to go to work. Murfree walked up to Bud Gregory and nodded. "Hello," said Murfree. "I hear you're in trouble." Bud Gregory looked up. "My gosh," he said helplessly. "It's Mr. Murfree, the government man." "Not a government man any more," said Murfree. "I've got some money for you." You don't owe me no money, Mr. Murfree," said Bud Gregory unhappily. He peered around Murfree with gloomy suspicion and asked, "You got some detectives with you?" "Not a soul," said Murfree. "But I have got some money for you. You sold me a gadget once. You'd used it to fix my car." Bud Gregory spread out his hands. "You paid me for that, Mr. Murfree. You paid me $600. I lived on that for a long time. I ate hog meat and drunk beer, and me and my family came clear across the United States on that money, Mr. Murfree. But you don't owe me no more." "We'll go and get some beer," said Murfree. "It may take some explaining." Bud Gregory cheered. He looked uneasily about, but Murfree had always played fair with him. Their meeting had been in a tiny village in the Smokies when Murfree's car overheated and froze, and Bud Gregory produced a gadget which was made of stray radio parts. He plugged it in a light socket and attached it to Murfree's car. Immediately, the car wasn't stuck fast. It ran. When fresh oil was spread about, it was as good as new. Bud Gregory explained casually that the gadget made some sort of stuff, perhaps electronic, which made pieces of metal slide easily on each other. Later, in an emergency, he sold the gadget to Murfree for $600, and Murfree could make it work, but he had never been able to understand it. Neither had the most eminent scientists of the United States, nor could any of them duplicate it so the duplicate would work. It demonstrably eliminated all friction, all from any device to which it was attached, but it remained an enigma. With beer before them, Murfree passed 5 $10 bills across the table. He did not dare offer more, knowing Gregory. "You sold me that dinkus which stops all friction," said Murfree casually. "I can't understand it, nor can anybody else. But it still works. So, since it belonged to me, when I got out of government service, I took it to a big power generating station. I explained what it would do. We hooked it on the big turbine, and it not only stopped all friction in the bearings, but it ended steam friction against the rotor blades and baffles. The efficiency of the whole setup rose by something over 8%. Bud Gregory looked longingly at the $50. "But you don't owe me no money," he said unhappily. "You've got $10 a day coming to you as long as that dinkus keeps on working," said Murfree casually. "If you ever want more money, just make another one or show me how to do it, and I'll take care of the situation." Bud Gregory blinked. Then he grew expansive as realization came. "Mr. Murfree, you a gentleman," he said expansively. "Soon's my boy's toes get well and I got me a new car, I won't have to worry about nothing. You come on out to the house with me. My old woman, when she hears this news, is going to cook you a dinner that'll sure say thank you. And I'll get some beer and some 10-cent cigars." Murfree nodded. He had a telegram in his pocket. The background count of Geiger-Miller tubes was up to 60 on the coast here. The soil of the United States was just 30 times as radioactive as it should be. When it reached a certain point, now not so far away. Back and forth, day after day, the little tuna boats worked busily. They were equipped with bait tanks and refrigeration units for such tuna as they might catch, but they made no attempt to catch them. Their only purposeful activity seemed to be towing torpedo-shaped containers of lead to points some hundreds of miles from their base island, and then allowing the volatile liquid in the containers to flow out on the surface of the ocean and be carried away eastward as vapor. They took great pains not to be sighted by any other vessel as they went out, tow loaded with its enigmatic liquid, or returned with it empty. They had been fortunate. Only one such tow had had to be scuttled when a Trans-Pacific clipper soared overhead early in their traffic. Whatever they were trying to do, they seemed to meet with no obstacles as they carried out their purpose. Murfree still hadn't the faintest idea what could be the cause of the excess radioactivity of American soil alone. The newspapers hadn't found out about it. They probably wouldn't realize the potential danger if they did. But the lives of 140 million people were at the mercy of a completely unexplained phenomenon, unless Bud Gregory somehow solved the problem. Murfree's problem was to get him to work on it. I